The request for water. The cabin of Flight 763 was bathed in a dim golden glow as the airplane climbed steadily to its cruising altitude. Marcus Hayes, a well-dressed businessman in his late 30s, adjusted the sleeves of his tailored Navy suit and leaned back in his plush first-class seat. The hum of the engines was steady, and the soft murmur of passengers engaging in light conversation filled the cabin. It had been a long day of meetings, and though he was no stranger to business travel, fatigue was starting to creep into his bones. He reached up and pressed the call button, the small chime signaling to the flight attendants that a passenger required assistance. All he wanted was a simple glass of water, something to soothe the dryness in his throat. A few moments later, a young blonde flight attendant appeared. Her name tag read Claire. She was poised, her uniform immaculate, her expression a mask of professional politeness. Yet there was something almost mechanical about her demeanor as she approached. "Yes?" she asked briskly, her eyes briefly flicking over Marcus but not quite meeting his gaze. Marcus offered a polite smile. "Could I get a glass of water, please?" Claire hesitated, just for a second. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but Marcus saw it. "I'll be right back," she replied, her tone cool, distant. Without another word, she turned on her heel and strode down the aisle, vanishing behind the thick navy curtain that led to the galley. Marcus exhaled softly, settling back into his seat. Maybe she was busy. Maybe he was reading too much into it. After all, flight attendants had dozens of tasks to juggle at once. He decided to wait patiently, watching as the other attendants moved fluidly through the cabin, attending to passengers with cheerful efficiency. Minutes ticked by. 5, 10, 15. No water. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He watched Claire weave through the first-class cabin, smiling warmly as she stopped by an older gentleman seated just across the aisle. The man hadn't pressed his call button, nor did he seem to have requested anything. Yet Claire leaned in and asked with a bright, engaging tone, "Would you care for a glass of water or perhaps a drink?" The man, slightly surprised but pleased, nodded. "Oh, sure. A glass of water would be nice. Thank you." Claire beamed, nodding as she turned toward the galley. Less than a minute later, she returned, carefully placing a glass of cold water in front of the man. Marcus felt a slow, sinking sensation in his chest. He glanced down at the call button he had pressed earlier. It had been close to 20 minutes since he made his request. He shifted his gaze back to Claire. As she moved down the aisle, she stopped again, this time to check on a young couple seated near the window. "Would you two like some more water or a snack?" she asked them sweetly. The couple nodded, and Claire disappeared into the galley, returning moments later with 2 glasses of ice water and a small bag of snacks. Marcus swallowed, a quiet frustration bubbling inside him. His request was simple, a glass of water. Yet, somehow, Claire had found time to attend to multiple passengers, proactively offering service, except to him. At first, he tried to dismiss it. Maybe she forgot. Maybe she got sidetracked. But the longer he observed, the clearer it became. She hadn't forgotten. She was deliberately ignoring him. The realization settled heavily on his shoulders. Familiar, yet no less painful. This wasn't the first time he had felt this kind of exclusion. The quiet, insidious kind. The kind that left no overt insults, no outright refusal, yet made it painfully obvious that he wasn't being treated the same as everyone else. He pressed the call button again. The soft chime echoed through the cabin. Claire appeared within seconds, her expression noticeably less welcoming than before. Her posture stiffened as she stopped beside his seat, her arms crossing slightly over her chest. "Yes?" she asked curtly. Marcus kept his tone calm and even. "I had asked for a glass of water earlier. Could you please bring it to me?" Claire exhaled sharply through her nose, her expression tightening. "You're not the only passenger on this flight," she snapped. "I'll get to you when I have time." She turned on her heel and walked away before Marcus could respond. Silence. A few passengers nearby had overheard the exchange. An older woman glanced at Marcus with a look of quiet sympathy. A man seated 2 rows ahead subtly turned his head, brow furrowed. Marcus gripped the armrests of his seat, his jaw tightening. This wasn't just about water anymore. It was about being seen. About being treated with the same respect as any other passenger in first class. He had been patient. He had been polite. He had given Claire every opportunity to simply do her job. Instead, she had chosen to dismiss him. Marcus could feel the pulse of tension in his chest, but he forced himself to remain composed. Losing his temper wouldn't help the situation. Instead, he reached down, pulled out his phone, and hit the record button. If Claire wanted to pretend he didn't exist, then he would make sure there was undeniable proof that he did, and that her behavior was not going unnoticed. The moment of truth. The cabin of Flight 763 was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of newspaper pages and the murmur of conversations. The hum of the aircraft provided a steady backdrop to the soft clinking of glasses as flight attendants served drinks to passengers who hadn't even needed to ask. Marcus sat still, his phone discreetly recording on the armrest beside him. His heartbeat was steady, but inside, he felt a quiet storm brewing. He had been patient, far more patient than he needed to be. But Claire's dismissive words still lingered in the air. "You're not the only passenger on this flight. I'll get to you when I have time." She had time for others, just not for him. He watched her move down the aisle, smiling warmly as she bent slightly to speak with an elderly woman near the front row. The contrast between her warmth toward other passengers and her iciness toward him was undeniable. Marcus knew what this was. He had seen it before, felt it before. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was real. Discrimination had a way of wearing a mask. It rarely shouted. It whispered. It lingered in delayed service, in dismissive tones, in the way some people's needs were immediately met while others were forced to wait. But today, Marcus wasn't going to let it slide. A silent witness. A few rows ahead, a man in a charcoal gray suit subtly turned his head, his expression neutral but observant. The man had noticed. Others had too. Marcus could see it in their eyes, the quiet recognition of something that wasn't quite right. Lisa, a young woman with neatly styled blonde hair and a professional demeanor, had been watching since Claire first ignored Marcus. At first, she hadn't thought much of it. Flight attendants were busy, and sometimes things got overlooked. But as she continued to observe, it became evident that Marcus was being treated differently. Lisa nudged the man sitting next to her, whispering, "She still hasn't brought him his water." The man nodded slightly. "I noticed." Lisa frowned. "She's been serving everyone else, even people who didn't ask." The man sighed, setting down his newspaper. "It's not right." Lisa glanced back at Marcus. He wasn't making a scene. He wasn't causing trouble. He was just waiting longer than anyone should have to for something as simple as a glass of water. And she could see that he knew exactly why. The third call. Marcus pressed the call button again. The soft chime rang through the first-class cabin, drawing the attention of a few more passengers. Claire appeared a few seconds later, but her expression was different this time. Less composed, more irritated. She folded her arms across her chest, her voice sharp. "What now?" Marcus exhaled slowly. His voice remained calm, steady. "I've been waiting for quite a while. Could I please have the glass of water I requested earlier?" Claire scoffed, rolling her eyes. "I already told you. I'll get to you when I have time." A silence settled between them. It wasn't just the words she had spoken, but the way she had said them. Her body language, her tone, the sheer contempt in her voice. Marcus let the silence stretch just long enough to make her uncomfortable before he spoke again. "It seems you had time for everyone else." Claire's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me. I've watched you serve multiple passengers who never pressed the call button. Marcus said, his voice smooth but firm. "I was the first one to make a request, and yet here we are." A ripple of whispers spread through the cabin. Lisa glanced at the man beside her, her jaw tightening. The man who had received the unsolicited glass of water earlier shifted in his seat, now realizing he had unknowingly been part of something much larger. Marcus continued, "I'm simply asking for the same level of service as the other passengers. If that's too much to expect, then perhaps we have a different issue altogether." Claire's expression darkened. "I don't have to explain myself to you." Her voice had an edge now, like she was daring him to push the issue further. The air in the cabin shifted. The tension was thick, heavy. Passengers had stopped pretending not to listen. Now, they were openly watching. Marcus could feel their attention. Some looked curious. Others looked concerned. A few, like Lisa, looked outraged on his behalf. Claire, however, seemed to be the only one unaware of the ground slipping from beneath her feet. "You're right," Marcus said simply, his voice measured. "You don't have to explain yourself to me, but you will have to explain yourself to someone." Claire scoffed, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "And who exactly am I supposed to explain myself to?" Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for his phone and stopped the recording. Then he smiled. "To whoever's in charge of this flight, the first-class witnesses." Lisa didn't hesitate. She reached up and pressed her own call button. A few seconds later, the chime sounded again, this time from another seat. Then another. Then another. One by one, passengers in first class began pressing their call buttons, their faces set with quiet determination. Claire's face paled. What are you all doing?" A middle-aged man with silver hair, dressed in an expensive-looking blazer, spoke first. His voice was calm but firm. "We've all been washing, and we're not okay with this." Lisa crossed her arms. "You served every other passenger promptly. Except him." The man nodded. "And we'd like to speak to the lead flight attendant, or the captain." Claire took a step back, her throat working as she struggled for words. I was just busy." Lisa cut her off. "Busy with everyone except him." Claire's mouth opened, but no words came out. The weight of the moment was pressing down on her now. She wasn't just facing Marcus anymore. She was facing everyone. The captain's intervention. It took only a few minutes for the lead flight attendant, the composed woman in her 40s named Michelle, to arrive. Claire's face was burning red now, her body tense as she stood frozen in place. Michelle scanned the cabin, then turned to Claire. "What's going on?" Before Claire could speak, Marcus calmly explained the situation. He kept his tone professional, straightforward, just the facts. Then, for the finishing touch, he played the recording. Claire's sharp, dismissive words rang out clearly. "You're not the only passenger on this flight. I'll get to you when I have time." Michelle's eyes darkened. Passengers murmured. The truth was out. Michelle turned to Claire, her voice dangerously calm. "Step to the back of the plane. Now." Claire hesitated, as if considering arguing. Then she saw the captain standing near the cockpit door, arms crossed, watching. Her breath hitched. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the back of the plane. As she disappeared beyond the curtain, Michelle turned back to Marcus. "Mr. Hayes, I sincerely apologize for what just happened. This is not how we conduct ourselves. You will be receiving a formal apology from our airline." She then turned to the other passengers. "And thank you, to all of you, for standing up when you saw something unfair." A few passengers nodded. Lisa smiled slightly. Marcus exhaled, his chest feeling lighter. Today, he wasn't invisible. And today, justice had been served. The weight of a moment. The first-class cabin of Flight 763 had transformed. Gone was the quiet murmur of polite conversation, the clinking of glasses, the usual ambience of luxury travel. Instead, an unmistakable tension lingered in the air. thick like an approaching storm. Claire had just walked away, escorted to the back of the plane after being publicly reprimanded by Michelle, the lead flight attendant. The murmurs of passengers filled the space, a mix of curiosity, concern, and quiet satisfaction. They had witnessed injustice, and now they had witnessed accountability. Marcus sat still in his seat, his fingers gently resting on his phone, which now held evidence of the entire exchange. His heart was steady, but his mind was still processing everything. He had only wanted a glass of water, a simple, human request. Yet the situation had escalated into something far larger. Across the aisle, Lisa leaned slightly toward him, her expression a mix of admiration and empathy. "That was powerful," she said softly. Marcus turned his head slightly, studying her. She wasn't just being polite. He could see it in her eyes. She had felt what had happened. She had recognized the quiet discrimination for what it was. "I just wanted fairness," Marcus said, his voice even. Lisa nodded. "And you got it, but only because you made sure it couldn't be ignored." Marcus exhaled, glancing around the cabin. Some passengers still whispered among themselves. A few had returned to their books and movies, trying to move past the incident. But others, those who had spoken up with him, exchanged small nods with Marcus, as if silently affirming that they were glad they had taken a stand. He appreciated it, but he also knew this moment wasn't over yet, an unfinished battle. Minutes passed. Then Michelle returned. The lead flight attendant approached with a composed, professional expression, but Marcus could tell by the way she straightened her blazer that she was still processing the severity of what had just happened. "Mr. Hayes," she said, addressing him formally, "on behalf of the airline, I want to personally apologize again for the treatment you received from our crew member. That is not the level of service we uphold, and I assure you, this is being taken seriously." Marcus studied her, trying to gauge the sincerity of her words. She seemed genuine, but he knew corporate apologies all too well. "Is Claire still on this flight?" Marcus asked, his tone measured. Michelle hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Yes. However, she has been relieved of her duties for the remainder of the flight. She is currently seated in the crew area. And upon landing, she will be met by our airline representatives for an immediate internal review." That was something. Still, Marcus had one more question. "And what happens next?" Michelle pressed her lips together, as if carefully considering her words. "That decision will be made by upper management. However, I will be filing a full report, and I encourage you to submit a formal complaint as well." Marcus nodded. "I intend to." Michelle hesitated again, then sighed. "I also want to thank you for how you handled the situation. You kept your composure, and that makes a difference." Marcus didn't answer right away. He simply stared at her, letting her feel the weight of the moment. Then finally, he said, "It shouldn't be on me to handle these things. It should be on the airline to make sure they don't happen in the first place." Michelle's shoulders tensed slightly, but she nodded. "You're right." She meant it. He could tell. Still, it didn't change what had already happened. As Michelle turned and walked away, Marcus knew the issue wasn't closed. Not yet. The conversations that followed. As the plane sailed smoothly through the sky, the tension slowly began to fade, but not completely. The incident still lingered in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Passengers continued to glance at Marcus from time to time, as if measuring whether they should say something. Lisa, however, had no such hesitation. She turned fully toward Marcus, curiosity flickering across her face. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but does this kind of thing happen often?" Marcus looked at her, his jaw tightening for just a second. Then he gave a small, tired smile. "More than you'd think," he said. Lisa exhaled, shaking her head. "That's infuriating." Marcus chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "It is. But what's worse is when people pretend it's not happening, when they look the other way." Lisa frowned, glancing around the cabin. "You're right. But today, at least, people didn't look away." That was true. And it gave Marcus the smallest sense of hope. Not because the world had suddenly changed in one flight, but because, for once, people had noticed. They had spoken up, and that mattered. The unexpected apology. Just as Marcus was beginning to relax, a shadow appeared in his peripheral vision. It was the captain. The murmurs in the cabin halted instantly. The presence of the captain in the passenger area was highly unusual, and it sent a wave of curiosity rippling through the first-class cabin. Marcus sat up slightly straighter as the captain, a man in his mid-50s, with graying hair and a firm but kind expression, approached him directly. The captain extended his hand. "Mr. Hayes, I am Captain Robertson. I wanted to personally apologize for what happened on this flight." Marcus shook his hand. Taken slightly off guard, he had expected corporate responses, not personal ones. "I appreciate that," Marcus said simply. The captain glanced around at the passengers. "I also want to commend those of you who spoke up. It takes courage to stand against unfairness, and that's something I respect." A few passengers nodded. Lisa smiled slightly. Then the captain's expression darkened slightly, and his voice lowered just a fraction as he added, "I also want you to know that there will be serious consequences for what happened here today. The airline does not tolerate this kind of behavior." Marcus appreciated the sentiment, but he had to ask, "Do you really believe that, or are you just saying what needs to be said?" The captain didn't look offended. If anything, he looked thoughtful. Then, after a moment, he nodded. "I believe it." That was enough. For now. A flight that would be remembered. As the flight continued, the cabin slowly returned to normal. But Marcus knew this moment wouldn't be forgotten. Not by him, not by the passengers who had witnessed it, and certainly not by Claire. She had made a choice, and now she would have to live with the consequences. As the plane prepared for landing, Marcus received a message from the airline's head of customer experience, requesting to speak with him after the flight. Something told him this was just the beginning. Ripples of a single act. The wheels of Flight 763 touched down on the smooth tarmac with a gentle jolt, signaling the end of a journey that had been far more than just miles traveled. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Marcus sat still, his gaze fixed on the window, watching the airport lights flicker against the deepening twilight sky. He wasn't the same man who had boarded this plane. Sure, he was still Marcus Hayes, a businessman, a frequent traveler. But something had shifted. The events of the last few hours had peeled back yet another layer of how the world sometimes saw him, or didn't. Passengers gathered their belongings, stretching as they prepared to disembark. But the weight of what had happened still clung to the air. Conversations, hushed but pointed, swirled in the background. Some passengers glanced at Marcus, others at the curtains separating first class from the galley where Claire had disappeared. They all knew this wasn't over. The walk of shame. As the doors of the plane finally swung open, the first-class passengers began moving toward the exit. Marcus waited, knowing he was in no rush. And then it happened. Claire reappeared. Her posture was stiff, her face pale. She wasn't the same confident, dismissive flight attendant who had scoffed at Marcus just hours ago. Instead, she looked defeated, her uniform now feeling less like a badge of authority and more like a weight she couldn't bear. A uniformed airline official stood at the entrance of the plane, waiting for her. Claire's expression tightened as she realized there was no escaping what was coming. The official nodded at her, gesturing toward the jet bridge. Claire's eyes darted around nervously, searching for an escape, but there wasn't one. The murmurs from passengers followed her like whispers of judgment as she took slow, measured steps past them. Some passengers shook their heads in quiet disapproval. Lisa, who had been one of the first to stand up for Marcus, didn't look away. She made direct eye contact with Claire, her gaze sharp and unwavering. Claire flinched and quickly turned her head. As she passed Marcus, Her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to say something, but she didn't. Instead, she lowered her head and walked past him, disappearing down the jet bridge. It wasn't a victory, not exactly, but it was justice, an invitation to accountability. As Marcus stepped off the plane, he spotted a well-dressed woman in her late 40s standing near the gate, her eyes scanning the passengers. The navy blue blazer she wore bore the airline's logo, and the seriousness in her expression told him that she was waiting for him. "Mr. Hayes?" she asked, stepping forward with an outstretched hand. Marcus gave her a firm handshake. "That's me. My name is Eleanor Carter. I'm the airline's head of customer experience. I'd like to speak with you about what happened on your flight." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You're already aware of it." Eleanor nodded, glancing down at the tablet in her hand. "The lead flight attendant, the captain, and several passengers have already submitted reports. Additionally," she hesitated for just a second, "I believe you have a recording of the incident." Marcus studied her, noting how carefully she was choosing her words. She knew this wasn't just about an internal review. This was about damage control. "I do," Marcus confirmed. Eleanor sighed. "Would you be willing to share it with us?" Marcus tilted his head. "That depends. What does sharing it change? Is this just for internal review, or is the airline actually going to take action?" Eleanor didn't flinch. "We take these matters very seriously. Claire has been suspended indefinitely while we conduct a formal review, but we also recognize that this is part of a larger issue, one that goes beyond just one employee." She hesitated before continuing. "We would like to invite you to sit down with our executive team. Not just for an apology, but to discuss real policy changes." Marcus blinked. He hadn't expected that. "Policy changes?" Eleanor nodded. "Yes, we recognize that bias, whether conscious or unconscious, affects customer service, and we need to address it at a systemic level. We want to hear your thoughts on how we can improve." Marcus studied her carefully. He had been on the receiving end of corporate apologies before. Empty words, hollow promises. But there was something in Eleanor's tone that told him this wasn't just damage control. This was a real opportunity. "All right," Marcus said, slipping his phone from his pocket. "But before I share anything, I want to know exactly what kind of changes you're willing to make." Eleanor's lips pressed together, and then she nodded. "Fair enough. Let's talk." The power of a story. As they walked through the terminal toward the airline's private lounge, Marcus could feel the eyes of other passengers on him. Some looked at him with respect, others with curiosity, and a few, unfortunately, with the kind of resentment that always came when someone challenged the system. But Marcus wasn't here to be liked. He was here to make a difference. Inside the private lounge, Marcus sat across from Eleanor as she pulled up a document on her tablet. "The airline is planning to implement mandatory inclusivity training for all staff," she began. "Not just flight attendants, but also ground crew, customer service representatives, and management." Marcus nodded. "That's a start. But training alone isn't enough. What about accountability measures?" Eleanor looked at him, intrigued. "Go on." "If a flight attendant engages in discriminatory behavior, what happens?" Marcus asked. "Is there a tracking system? A report log? A review process? Or do these complaints just disappear after a verbal warning?" Eleanor exhaled. "Currently, we don't have a formal tracking system for complaints related to bias. But maybe we should." Marcus leaned forward. "Absolutely. Otherwise, these incidents just keep happening. It's one thing to educate employees, but if there's no accountability, the system never changes." Eleanor tapped a note into her tablet. "What else would you suggest?" Marcus thought for a moment. "Passengers need a clear, direct way to report these incidents in real time, maybe through the airline's app or an anonymous complaint form. That way, concerns can be addressed immediately, not just after a flight has landed." Eleanor nodded, typing as he spoke. "I agree." For the next hour, they built a plan. A real plan. Not just for Claire. Not just for Marcus. But for every future passenger who might otherwise suffer in silence. The aftermath. 2 days later, the airline released a public statement. Claire had been terminated following a full review. The airline was implementing mandatory inclusivity training across all staff. A passenger reporting system was being developed. Marcus Hayes had been invited as a consultant to help reshape the airline's policies. The story went viral. News outlets picked it up. Social media exploded. People shared their own experiences of discrimination in customer service. And for once, just once, it felt like something had truly changed. Marcus sat in his office, reading the airline's official statement, his phone lighting up with messages from people who had followed the story. Lisa had texted him, "You made a difference." And for the first time in a long time, Marcus actually believed it. He had spoken up, and the world had listened. The ripple effect. The airline lounge was a quiet, sophisticated space, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the runway. Outside, planes taxied, lifting off into the evening sky, each carrying hundreds of passengers toward their destinations. For Marcus, this moment felt different. He had spent years traveling for business, sitting in first-class seats, walking through VIP lounges. But never before had he felt so visible, not as a respected professional, but as someone who had been forced to prove his worth, to fight for basic dignity. And now he was sitting across from Eleanor Carter, the head of customer experience, discussing real systemic changes. "All right," Eleanor said, setting her tablet aside, her gaze locked onto Marcus. "Let's talk about implementation. If we're going to do this, we need to do it right." A plan that mattered. Marcus leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. The biggest problem with corporate diversity training is that it's usually performative. A couple of PowerPoint slides, a scripted lecture, then business as usual. Eleanor nodded. "I agree. That's why we want to go deeper. What would you suggest?" Marcus didn't hesitate. 3 things: mandatory, monitored, and measurable. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Explain." "First, the training needs to be mandatory for every employee. Not optional. Not just for new hires. Every single person working under this airline. Flight attendants, customer service reps, pilots, executives. Everyone. It needs to be a fundamental part of the job." Eleanor took a note. "All right. Mandatory. What's next?" "Monitored. There should be real consequences for non-compliance. If an employee doesn't complete the training or gets repeat complaints, that needs to be tracked. Because right now, there's no system in place to ensure people actually apply what they're learning." Eleanor gave a small nod. "And measurable." Marcus's eyes sharpened. "There needs to be a data-driven system that measures bias-related complaints. Every reported incident should be logged, whether it's about racial discrimination, gender bias, or any other unfair treatment. Over time, the airline can analyze patterns. Which employees are repeat offenders? Are certain flight routes or teams generating more complaints? That data needs to be collected and acted upon." Eleanor exhaled. "That's a major overhaul." Marcus met her gaze. "It's necessary." She nodded, jotting down more notes. "I can bring this up in our executive meeting. If we implement a passenger reporting system, we can start tracking these incidents and responding in real time." Marcus tapped the table. "That's exactly what needs to happen. And it needs to be accessible. Most people don't even know how to file a complaint. They assume their voices won't be heard. The reporting system should be easy to access from your app, website, and even onboard flights. A QR code on every seatback that links to the form, a direct button in the airline app. The more accessible it is, the harder it becomes to ignore these issues." Eleanor smiled slightly. "I like that. It removes excuses." Marcus nodded. "Exactly. Make it so easy to report incidents that no one can pretend they didn't know how." Eleanor sat back, processing everything. This is a lot, but it's good. If we do this right, we're not just fixing one mistake. We're setting a new standard for how we treat passengers. Marcus crossed his arms. That's the goal. An unlikely invitation. There was a long pause before Eleanor spoke again, her voice more measured this time. You know, I didn't just ask you here to apologize, or to discuss policy. Marcus raised an eyebrow. No. Eleanor hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. I want you to help us build this, not just as a consultant, but as someone who can actually shape the way we approach inclusivity and fairness in this company. Marcus stared at her, caught off guard. You want me to work for the airline? Eleanor shook her head. Not full-time, but as an advisor. We bring in outside voices all the time. People who understand our weaknesses better than we do, and clearly you understand them better than most. Marcus exhaled, leaning back in his chair. He had never expected this. He had come here thinking he was just making sure Claire faced the consequences of her actions. But now he had a chance to change the system itself. It was tempting. But before he agreed, he had to ask, why me? Eleanor's expression softened, because most people would have just walked off that flight. Most people wouldn't have pressed record. They wouldn't have stayed calm under pressure. But you did. And that tells me you're not just looking for an apology. You're looking for real change. Marcus studied her. You really think the airline will go through with this? Eleanor smiled slightly. That depends. Are you going to help us hold ourselves accountable? Marcus chuckled under his breath. That almost sounds like a challenge. Eleanor smirked. Maybe it is. Marcus thought for a long moment, staring out the window at the runway. He had spent years witnessing bias, feeling it, experiencing it, and he had always hated how people in power either ignored it or made empty promises to fix it. But now he had a seat at the table, and he had no intention of wasting it. Finally, he turned back to Eleanor. All right, I'm in. The statement that shocked the industry. 3 days later, the airline released an official statement. Claire had been terminated following a full internal investigation. The airline was launching a real-time passenger reporting system for bias-related incidents. Mandatory inclusivity training would be expanded and monitored for all employees. Marcus Hayes had been brought on as an official advisor to help reshape airline policies. The reaction was immediate. Social media exploded. Passengers from across the world shared their own experiences with discrimination in travel, calling for other airlines to implement similar reforms. News outlets ran the story. Some praised the airline for taking swift action. Others questioned whether this was just a PR move. Industry leaders took notice. Other major airlines began issuing their own statements about how they planned to reassess their own policies. And Marcus received thousands of messages from strangers, from fellow passengers, from business leaders who had faced the same struggles. One message stood out. From Lisa. You turned one moment into something bigger. That's incredible. Thank you for not letting it go. Marcus exhaled, letting a small smile cross his lips. One moment, one voice. And now, the entire industry was listening. A legacy in motion. The world had changed overnight, or at least his world had. When Marcus Hayes woke up the morning after the airline's public statement went live, he had no idea how much his life was about to shift. His phone had been blowing up for hours. Hundreds of unread messages, social media notifications flooding in. His email inbox was a war zone, from news outlets, corporate executives, strangers who had followed his story. Marcus wasn't someone who sought attention. He had spent most of his career as a behind-the-scenes dealmaker, navigating the corporate world with sharp intellect and quiet authority. He never intended to be the face of a movement. But the world had decided otherwise. The calls that changed everything. Before he even had his first sip of coffee, his phone rang. The caller ID read Eleanor Carter, the airline's head of customer experience. Marcus sighed, rubbing his temples before answering. "Good morning, Eleanor." "Good morning, Marcus," she replied, her voice calm but urgent. "I hope you're ready, because you're about to be a very, very busy man." Marcus exhaled. "Let me guess. Media requests." "More than that," Eleanor said. "I just got off the phone with a senior executive from the International Airline Council. They want to talk to you." Marcus blinked. "Why?" "Because what happened on your flight isn't just about one airline, Marcus. It's about the entire industry," Eleanor said. "Other airlines are scrambling to respond. Some are issuing vague promises about diversity initiatives. Others, they're terrified that the next viral incident could happen on their planes." Marcus leaned back in his chair. He had expected some media buzz, maybe a few think pieces, but this was bigger. "You're telling me they actually want to listen?" Marcus asked. "They have to listen," Eleanor replied, "because people are watching now." The corporate reckoning. Within days, Marcus found himself in the middle of a corporate firestorm. Every major airline was now reviewing its policies, some quietly, some publicly. The pressure was mounting. News outlets were running segments on bias in customer service, fueled by Marcus's experience. And then, the invitations started rolling in. A panel discussion at an international aviation summit, a private meeting with the CEO of one of the largest airlines in the world, an invitation to testify at a congressional hearing about airline regulations and racial bias. Marcus sat in his office, scrolling through the invitations, his mind spinning. This wasn't what he had planned. He had taken a stand on that flight because he refused to be invisible, because he knew too many others had been ignored before him. But now, people were asking him to lead. And that was a different weight altogether. The public reaction. As Marcus scrolled through social media, he saw how his story had ignited something bigger. Hashtags were trending. Hashtag #FairSkisForAll. Hashtag No More Silent Flights. Hashtag Service with Respect. People were sharing their own experiences. A black woman in first class who had been skipped over multiple times for drink service. A Latino family who had been profiled by security before boarding. An Asian businessman who had been mistaken for an economy passenger despite holding a first-class ticket. Their stories were pouring in, and Marcus saw himself in every single one of them. The meeting that changed it all. A week after the airline's public statement, Marcus found himself in a high-rise conference room overlooking the city skyline. Across from him sat the CEO of the airline, along with a panel of top executives. Eleanor Carter was there too, her presence a quiet but firm reminder that this meeting mattered. The CEO, a sharp-dressed man in his early 50s, cleared his throat. "Mr. Hayes, first of all, let me say that I deeply regret the experience you had on our flight." Marcus nodded but didn't reply. He had heard enough corporate apologies in his lifetime to know that words meant nothing without action. The CEO continued, "We recognize that this issue goes beyond one employee. We need to fundamentally change the way we approach service, and that's why we've asked you here today." Marcus crossed his arms. "Go on." Eleanor interjected. "We want you to be more than just an advisor. We want you to help build the system that prevents this from happening again, not just for our airline, but for the industry." Marcus blinked. "You mean?" The CEO leaned forward. "We want to create a passenger equity council, a board that directly oversees customer service standards, bias complaints, and real-time reporting. And we want you to lead it." The room went silent. Marcus sat back in his chair, studying their faces. For the first time, he saw genuine intent. They weren't just doing this to save face. They were doing this because they knew they had to. He exhaled. "If I do this, I have conditions." The CEO nodded. "Name them." Marcus leaned forward. 1. This can't be a symbolic initiative. I want real authority to implement changes. If we find patterns of bias, I want the power to recommend firings, retraining, and policy changes. Done, the CEO said. 2. We don't just focus on flight attendants. We review every level of service, from gate agents to customer service reps to security personnel. Eleanor nodded. That's already in discussion. And 3. Marcus paused, his voice tightening. This isn't just about my experience. We need to open the floor to passengers worldwide. People need a way to be heard. The CEO exhaled slowly, then nodded. All right, we'll do it. Marcus studied him for a long moment before giving a slow nod. Then I'm in. A future in the making. The next morning, the airline released another statement. The creation of the Passenger Equity Council, led by Marcus Hayes, a permanent real-time reporting system for passengers. Immediate policy changes on how customer complaints were handled. And just like that, Marcus had gone from being a passenger ignored to a voice leading an industry shift. The final boarding call. Months later, Marcus sat in first class once again. The flight attendant approached, a young woman with kind eyes and a professional smile. Mr. Hayes, can I get you anything? Marcus looked up at her, studying her expression. No tension, no hesitation, just simple respect. Yes, he said with a small smile. A glass of water, please. She nodded. Absolutely. I'll be right back. And this time, she was. The movement takes flight. It had been 6 months since Marcus Hayes' name first became synonymous with change in the airline industry. 6 months since he had pressed that call button. Since Claire had dismissed him. Since a single moment of quiet injustice had ignited an industry-wide reckoning. Now, as he sat in a high-rise office in New York City, looking down at the city that never slept, he realized just how far this had gone beyond him. It wasn't just about one flight. It wasn't just about one airline. It was about every passenger who had ever been overlooked, ignored, or treated differently. And now, the world was finally listening. The Passenger Equity Council. A global shift. Marcus adjusted his tie as he stepped into the boardroom. The Passenger Equity Council, the initiative he had fought for, was now an official governing body with the power to hold airlines accountable. At the long glass conference table, industry leaders sat ready for discussion. Representatives from some of the world's biggest airlines, international regulatory agencies, and even government officials were in attendance. As Marcus took his seat, Eleanor Carter, his closest ally in the airline's leadership, offered him a small nod. "You ready for this?" she asked under her breath. Marcus exhaled. "I don't think I've had time to not be ready." Eleanor smirked. "Welcome to the world of change-making." The meeting began. One by one, they laid out the numbers. Data from the real-time reporting system Marcus had helped develop. 3,264 complaints of bias in service across multiple airlines in 6 months. 52% of incidents involved passengers of color. 30% involved implicit discrimination based on gender, age, or disability. Less than 10% of complaints had been properly addressed before the new system was implemented. The numbers were staggering. And they were just the beginning. A representative from another airline, a gray-haired executive with a measured expression, leaned forward. "These numbers are concerning," he admitted. "But what's more concerning is that we didn't have this data before. How many years did we let this go unchecked?" Marcus met his gaze evenly. "Exactly. That's why we're here today. It's time for systemic accountability." The conversation shifted to solutions. Mandatory inclusivity and bias training across all airlines. An international standard for real-time passenger complaint resolution. Transparent disciplinary action for employees with repeated complaints. One executive hesitated. "Won't this make our employees feel targeted?" Marcus didn't even blink. If they're treating passengers fairly, they have nothing to worry about. Silence. Then nods of agreement. For the first time in history, the aviation industry wasn't just acknowledging bias, it was actively dismantling it. Beyond the skies, expanding the fight for fairness. It didn't stop at airlines. Marcus' influence was expanding. His name was being mentioned in corporate diversity panels, leadership summits, even government hearings. One morning, he received a call from an unexpected source, the CEO of a luxury hotel chain. "Mr. Hayes, I wanted to speak with you personally," the man said, his voice calm yet urgent. Marcus leaned back in his chair. "I'm listening. I've been following your work, and quite frankly, I think we have a bias issue in the hospitality industry as well. Would you be open to helping us develop a system to ensure fair treatment for all guests, just like you did with the airlines?" Marcus was taken aback, but only for a second, because he had heard the stories. Black and brown travelers being asked to show extra verification when checking into high-end hotels. Women receiving worse service at business lounges unless they were with a male companion. Guests being ignored, overlooked, and treated as though they didn't belong in the very places they had paid to be in. Marcus tapped his fingers on the desk. "Tell me more." And just like that, the fight for fairness extended beyond the skies. The public response. A movement born. Marcus' work was no longer just his own. It had become a movement. Social media had transformed his story into something much bigger. Passengers, hotel guests, retail shoppers, restaurant customers, people from all industries were speaking up about their own experiences with discrimination. The hashtags had evolved. Hashtag Travel with Dignity. Hashtag No More Insolent Service. Hashtag Every Customer Matters. And major companies were taking notice. Some embraced the movement. Others resented it, seeing it as a threat to the way they had been operating for years. One particularly outspoken CEO tweeted, "What happened to Marcus Hayes was unfortunate, but let's not turn this into a corporate witch hunt. Service industry workers have enough on their plates." The backlash was immediate. Marcus himself responded with a single, powerful message. Service workers do have enough on their plates. That's why ensuring equal treatment shouldn't be an extra task. It should be a fundamental standard. His tweet went viral in minutes. The cost of speaking out. Not everyone was happy with Marcus' rise in influence. Corporate leaders who had thrived in unchecked systems were pushing back. There were whispers that Marcus was too aggressive in his demands for fairness, that his fight was unnecessary because discrimination wasn't really a problem anymore, that he was only doing this for attention. Marcus knew the tactics all too well. When a black man stands up for himself, he is often labeled as angry. When a woman demands fair treatment, she is called difficult. When a person of color challenges the system, they are told they are imagining things. But Marcus was undeterred, because the people who needed this change, they sought him, they supported him, and that was enough. The final flight, a full circle moment. One evening, after months of meetings, conferences, and industry shifts, Marcus finally boarded a flight just for himself. No meetings, no corporate discussions, just him, a quiet seat, and a trip home. As he settled into his first-class seat, a flight attendant approached him. She was young, with warm brown eyes and a polite professional demeanor. "Good evening, Mr. Hayes," she said with a smile. "Would you like something to drink?" Marcus looked up at her, waiting. She didn't hesitate, didn't look past him, didn't ignore him. He smiled. "Yes," he said, "a glass of water, please." And this time, it wasn't a fight. It was just a flight, the way it always should have been.